When I think back to that night, I still feel a pain in my heart. I didn't know what would happen when I entered the hall, but there was a slight unease inside me. It was as if my body had understood before my mind that I didn't belong there. After all, this is what I had been made to feel for years, right? I had entered this family through marriage, but I had never truly been a part of it. To them, I had always been the outsider, especially to Greta, my mother-in-law. The wedding rehearsal dinner, as Greta called it, was a small celebration bringing together the prominent members of society. But it wasn't small. Everything was exaggerated: snow-white tablecloths, porcelain plates, crystal glasses, the sound of violins rising from the orchestra, and most piercing of all, that invisible thing, class distinction. As I stepped into the hall, I immediately looked around. People had already seated themselves, clinking glasses, laughing loudly, shouting to the world how much they belonged. One of the waiters approached me with a smile. "How may I assist you?" he asked. I couldn't find my name card. I checked the tables one by one, carefully, even stubbornly. I couldn't see Laura. My smile froze. At that moment, I heard the voice. Greta's voice. That voice, which tried to sound polite, but was accustomed to humiliating me in front of everyone, speaking with trained arrogance. "Ah, Laura." The whole room went silent. Her tone was loud, but not angry. It was measured, adorned with theatrical elegance. "There's no space left, my dear," she said, opening her eyes wide. "I only arranged a table for the closest family members today. But if you'd like, you can sit at the small table behind the kitchen. It should be free." It was as if murmurs and glances rose from every corner of the room. People smiled politely, but you could feel the shame and the enjoyment of the moment inside them. They all accompanied Greta's words not with laughter, but with an inward approval. For them, this little humiliation was just Greta's sense of humor. But for me, that moment was a threshold. I didn't freeze, I didn't cry, I didn't run away. I slowly turned my gaze to Greta. She was still smiling. One of the guests next to her had quietly extended her wine glass. Her body stood proud, her shoulders seeming to broaden a little, because she thought she had crushed me. Then my husband David came. He had arrived earlier, talking to some colleagues at the bar about company shares and investment news. Our eyes met. He saw what had happened. He paused for a few seconds, then he came over to me, his face showing a half-hearted expression of guilt. "Please, don't make a scene," he said in a low voice. "My mom is really stressed about this evening. She may have forgotten to arrange a seat." He didn't even look me in the eyes when he said this. It was as if he knew exactly what the problem was, but was trying to brush it off gently so it wouldn't come to light. I felt like screaming inside. I wanted to slam my fist on the table or throw one of those porcelain plates. But I did none of that. I smiled. "Of course," I said. "No problem." And I walked to the bathroom, but I didn't cry in front of the mirror. For the first time, I saw it clearly. The reason they had been looking down on me wasn't just because of class difference. It was my silence. Because they had never truly heard my voice, and I had gotten used to this silence for years. But that night, after that humiliation, for the first time, silence didn't feel like weakness to me. It felt like power. Because no matter how quietly you speak, people listen more carefully. And now I wouldn't speak. I would only watch. I would listen. I would learn. And when the time came, I would silently bring down their world. That night, I just looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. No tears, no anger, just one look. But for the first time, as I looked at myself, I thought, there's something that those who look down on you can't see. The meaning they had attached to my silence was wrong. My silence wasn't acceptance, it was preparation. From that moment on, I became a different person. I lived in the same house, sat at the same table, wore the same smiles. But inside me there was another woman now. She saw everything. After the wedding, Greta started preparing for a fundraising night that would shake the city. It looked like a charity night, but in reality, it would be an event to promote her company. Famous businessmen, media representatives, investors, even politicians. They were all invited. The one she had her eye on was clear: Leonard Weber. Leonard was the head of a large foundation. His sponsorship approval meant attracting investment to Greta's company and taking her name to an international level. Greta's biggest wish in life was never limited to her family. What she wanted was to make her name a brand. And that night, with Leonard's support, she would achieve that dream. I learned this during a dinner. David, his father, and Greta were sitting in the living room. Amidst half-drunk laughter, Greta accidentally let slip: "If Leonard comes, it's done. If I can impress him, I'll finally become a real player." Then she turned to me as if I wasn't there. Of course, not by sitting quietly like Laura, but by stepping onto the stage. I smiled, but this time, behind that smile, there was a thought. Leonard Weber. I immediately started researching. Quietly, without anyone noticing. And I learned. Leonard was a man who had supported local initiatives for years, but was very sensitive about one thing: transparency. Financial documents, audit records, employee rights. Greta's company, on paper, looked perfect, but I knew what was going on inside. From David's files, from the laptop he had left open at home, from whispered phone calls at night. Some of the projects that the company had donated to for advertising were actually just on paper. Those documents? They were now in my hands. One night, while David was in the bathroom, I saved those files from his computer onto a USB drive and quietly placed it in the drawer. I began to wait. Because Greta was about to step onto the stage. The lights would be on her, and Leonard would be there. At that moment, one single document would be enough. Revenge doesn't shout. Revenge walks silently. And when the time comes, it just opens the door. That night, I was the first to arrive in the hall. Everything was set for the big fundraising ball that Greta had called the night of her life. Crystal chandeliers, a live orchestra, white rose decorations surrounding the tables. And on stage, a giant screen. In collaboration with the Weber Foundation, Hope for the Future. In fact, this phrase had a completely different meaning for Greta. Hope for her wasn't just a fundraising night. It was Leonard Weber's signature. That signature would open doors to billion-dollar partnerships for her company, media visibility, and perhaps even a new political career. The stage she had built step by step over the years was that night, and I was the most invisible, yet the most dangerous part of that stage. I entered the hall, dressed simply but strikingly. Greta still had the habit of seating me at the back tables. This time, I was placed at the farthest corner of the room, at a table with the assistance of sponsors. But this time, my presence alone was enough. Because tonight, I wasn't on stage. I was in the director's chair behind the curtain. When Leonard Weber arrived, it was exactly 8 o'clock. As he stepped into the hall, the orchestra stopped, and everyone applauded. Greta went to him, extended her glass, and smiled. And as the guest of honor for the evening, she invited him onto the stage. I took my glass and waited for Leonard to sit at a table. Then, along with a waiter I had arranged earlier, a small envelope was sent in. Inside, there were only a few documents. I attached a note. "Dear Mr. Weber, these documents may directly concern the transparency principles of the Weber Foundation. I leave the decision to you. Best regards. An observer." The waiter delivered the envelope. I didn't take my eyes off him. Leonard opened the envelope and glanced through the files. His expression changed in an instant. His eyebrows furrowed. He placed his hand on his chin. Then he took out his phone from his pocket and slowly walked away from Greta's table. At that moment, nothing happened in the hall. Music was playing. Glasses were clinking. But I knew. The first domino had fallen. Greta's speech was planned for the end of the evening. Before stepping on stage, she wanted Leonard by her side, but at that moment, Leonard was still on the phone. His face was cold, calculated. When two foundation executives approached him, he shook his head. Greta walked towards them, but Leonard raised his hand and stopped the conversation. That's when our eyes met. He didn't know me, but I had told him everything. And now Greta would understand too. Minutes passed. When it was time for Greta to step on stage, Her name was announced. But Leonard still hadn't moved from his seat. The hall slowly grew quiet. As Greta walked towards the microphone, her voice trembled, but her face still wore that familiar mask of pride. "Thank you all for being here tonight. This partnership with the Weber Foundation." And that's when it happened. Leonard stood up. The hall went silent, and he spoke just one sentence. "As the Weber Foundation, we have decided to terminate this partnership due to ethical concerns." Silence. The room had turned to ice. Greta's lips parted, but no sound came out. She still held the microphone, but the words were gone. Because for the first time, Greta had lost control. Leonard turned and began to walk. Behind him, foundation executives, investors, and media representatives. And Greta was left alone on stage, under the lights. David stood up, wanting to go to his mother. But something stopped him. The whole room was watching him. I don't know what crossed his mind, but his eyes turned to me. And I simply nodded once. No, the stage wasn't mine. But this silent collapse had begun with my whisper. Sometimes a collapse doesn't come with a scream. Sometimes the greatest destructions begin in the most silent moments. And that night, everything in Greta's life began to crack after just one look. After the representatives of the Weber Foundation left the hall, the atmosphere in the room changed. No one said a word. The laughter, the conversations, the orchestra's strings. Everything seemed to stop at once. Until that moment, the crowd surrounding Greta had drawn an invisible boundary around her. Everyone was still there, but no one was with her anymore. Greta tried to say something into the microphone, but no sound came out. That grand stage was no longer her fortress. It was now an open square. She was vulnerable. After Leonard left, media representatives, followed by the advisors of the sponsors, started to leave the hall. Then, there were subtle posts on social media, crisis management emails from press consultants, messages in WhatsApp groups starting with, "Did you hear?" Meanwhile, I was still sitting in my seat, silently. But my eyes were recording everything. I felt like I was watching an invisible hand tearing down a palace, brick by brick. After that night, everything around Greta began to slowly drift away. First, the investors stopped answering calls. Then the PR team announced they were on annual leave. Her closest friends canceled brunch plans. The newspapers didn't wait. The headlines were ruthless. Ethical crisis. Greta H's empire is shaking. Shocking at the fundraising night. Why did the Weber Foundation end the partnership? David, however, was still trying to understand. One evening at home, he approached me with his hands in his pockets. "Do you know something?" he asked. There was a complicated expression in his eyes. A mix of doubt and fear. I shrugged. "I'm just watching what's happening," I said. And in that moment, David realized he wouldn't get an answer from me. But for Greta, this wasn't just a loss of reputation. This was a loss of identity, because she had always been the strong, cold, untouchable woman. People didn't revolve around her. They revolved around the idea of her. Now, that center was gone, and everyone was starting to scatter. One morning, she invited me for coffee. This was the first time she made a request. For the first time, it wasn't an order, but a gentle request. We sat across from each other in the kitchen, with sunlight shining on the counter. We took sips from our coffee. The silence was long. Then she said one sentence. "People like you, silent people, have always made me uneasy." I raised my head. Our eyes met. "Because you see everything," she said, "and you say nothing. But one day, you know exactly where to touch." For a moment, a small spark ignited inside me. It wasn't a feeling of revenge. It was acceptance. Perhaps the purest form of victory. "I didn't touch anyone," I said. "I only watched everyone take off their masks." That sentence hung in the air. Greta, with years of habit, wanted to give me a contemptuous look, but she couldn't. Because this time, she couldn't even look into her own eyes, let alone mine. That night, as I left my room, I looked at myself in the mirror. I never imagined that a kingdom could fall with the silence of a woman. But now I knew. Power isn't in the loudness of your voice. It's in the determination of your silence. And me, I wasn't even whispering to myself anymore, because it wasn't necessary. I had already spoken. The house was now a completely different place. The large house, where I used to feel suffocated as soon as I entered, where sharp thorns were hidden under smiles, was now silent, cold and foreign. It was as if the arrogance and noise inside everyone had retreated to the gaps between the couches, to the corners of the walls. Greta was no longer sitting in the middle of the room. She was in the corner of her room, where she used to get ready like a flower every morning and drink her coffee from a crystal cup. Now she sat for hours staring out the window in the same bathrobe, never even pulling the curtains open. Old friends who used to stop by the garden, investors who called, they were all gone. She could only see the faces of those who once bowed to her now in newspaper clippings, and they all ended with the same word: downfall. David, however, was still trying to make sense of what had happened. As usual, he thought he could solve problems by ignoring them. But this time, it wasn't the business world that was collapsing, it was emotions. And he had no plan for that. One evening, he knocked on my door. "Elena," he said quietly. His tone was soft, but there was fear behind it. "Can we talk?" I was reading a book at my desk, and I looked up. I glanced at the door. Then I returned to my book. "Come in," I said. He sat down. He placed his hands on his knees. He didn't turn towards me. It was as if he needed to explain himself to himself before the words came out. "I don't know what happened, but I never thought it would come to this. My mom was strong. You were. Silent. Maybe too silent. In that moment, if I were the old me, my eyes would have filled with tears, and I would have tried to understand him. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had played this scene in my mind countless times, and now the roles were complete. It was my turn to speak. "You know, David," I said, "in this house, I wasn't just your wife, I was your audience. I watched you. I watched your mother. I watched this life. I never needed to step onto the stage, because everyone believed too much in their own role." I paused for a moment. I looked at him, and he had lowered his head. For the first time, he was ashamed, but it was too late. Everyone in this house thought they were superior, but I became the invisible one, the one who only served, stayed silent, smiled. "You loved me this way because I didn't resist. But the truth is, I was never that woman. I was just waiting for the right time." "When did you change so much?" he whispered. I smiled. "I didn't change, David. I just stopped hiding myself." Then I left the room. I went downstairs, and I found Greta sitting alone in the garden. Her eyes were staring into space. There was an expression on her face I hadn't seen in years. Exhaustion. It was as if her mask had fallen, and she was finally alone with her true self. I had a small box in my hand. The bracelet my mother had given me on my wedding day. It had been sitting at the back of Greta's display for years. That bracelet represented the last connection I had when I came into this house. And now I was taking it back. I quietly took the box, placed it in my coat pocket without looking at her. Just as I was about to turn around, Greta spoke. "You won." I stopped. But I didn't turn. "I didn't fight," I said. "You lost your own battle." After that sentence, we didn't speak again. I got in the car. My suitcase was on the back seat. In my bag, there were keys, a few photos, some cash, and the new life I had chosen for myself. A life where I wasn't anyone's wife, daughter-in-law, or shadow. I took one last look at the house in the rearview mirror, but there was no sadness or regret in my eyes, because I wasn't leaving anything behind. I was just taking myself and leaving, and this time, I didn't even look back. Months passed. After the crowded tables, the extravagant invitations, and the roles I had been assigned, I now wake up in a life of my own choosing. The noise has been replaced with peace. I now live in a small house. The daylight coming through the kitchen window falls on the potted plants I've planted with my own hands. The furniture is simple, but everything belongs to me. I'm no longer in anyone's shadow. Not behind a husband, not beside a mother-in-law, nor lost in the expectations of others. I am just Laura, in the center of a life I have built with quiet but determined steps. At first, silence frightened me. Being alone had been a threat growing inside me for years, but over time, I realized that the voice of my true self was hidden in that silence. Now, every morning, I go for walks, work at a small cafe, and make eye contact with people I don't know but greet sincerely. No one asks my last name. No one defines me as someone something. This new life is giving me the chance to be myself for the first time. The other day, a card came in my mailbox. It was in a familiar envelope. I opened it. Inside was the listing for Greta's house. The roses in the garden had withered, the windows were shut, and the curtains were drawn. I didn't feel anger, nor the sweet thrill of revenge. Just relief. That house was no longer an address to me. It was a period. And I'd closed that period. That day I bought a small notebook and wrote one sentence on the first page. Thank you to those who tried to silence me. Because in my silence, I found myself. I closed the page, took a deep breath. Because the past was no longer a burden, just a landscape left behind. And with every step, I am getting closer to myself. If you found something of yourself in this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss new stories. Because sometimes a story is not just a story. Sometimes it is the sound of an awakening.